body language for business owners. Does it really make that much of a difference? It's interesting. I got into a conversation with an inner circle member who I've been coaching him for maybe 3 years now, and he's really made turn the corner on his business recently. He has a contracting business, and he's just doing exceedingly well compared to what he was doing in years past. And we've been spending a lot of time together, and he's really trying to understand all 4 different functions of the business, between the lead generation, the sales, the operations, the accounting. And he was a very sales focused organization in the past. And he's recognizing now how having a sales system is far superior to him learning how to be a good salesperson. Because having a good sales system, that can be replicated over and over and over again. And he's starting to recognize the fact that, when he's just trying to remember all the individual sales tips and the tricks and the overcoming objections and all of that stuff that's just kind of the punch you in the mouth sort of sales techniques, honestly, that's just, it's inconsistent, and I just don't think it's as effective as it could be with a sales system. So all that to say, we got into a conversation today about, we were talking about his being a more marketing focused and being more consistent in his marketing. And if he is much more consistent in his marketing, he doesn't even have to be as aggressive in his sales. That doesn't mean he has to suck at his sales. He still needs to understand his sales process. He still needs to make sure he's consistent. He still needs to make sure he's asking the same questions pretty consistently across the board. Of course, every individual is a little different. Every situation is a little different because he kind of does custom work. But pretty much, from top to bottom, he needs to make sure he's asking the same set of questions, and maybe depending on the individual, he may have to ask them in a slightly different way. So we got into this conversation about body language. Now, this is something that I really studied for quite a while. There was a gal back in the late 90s. Her name was Tanya Ryman, and she wrote a book on body language. I don't remember exactly the name of it, but she was a body language expert. And it was really funny because I really poured a lot of energy and effort into understanding and kind of deciphering body language. And it was interesting because at the time, and then later on when it came out with Bill Clinton and the whole Monica Lewinsky thing, it was kind of revealed that he gave himself away when he denied having sex with Monica Lewinsky. And it was interesting because he kind of wagged his finger at the press and said, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Monica Lewinsky." And he wagged his finger with his right hand. And it's interesting because Bill Clinton is a southpaw. He's a lefty. So had he really believed in what he was saying, he likely would have made more of a gesture with his left hand, not his right. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that he was lying. It just means that there was something that was not congruent. So the body language experts who literally watch these famous people just to see if they have some incongruity going on or incongruence. I'm not sure if incongruity is a word. You can hold me accountable to that. If it's not, tell me I'm wrong in the comments. But let's say, that incongruence showed up and all of a sudden it was like, oh, wait a minute. Something didn't smell right about what he just did there. So it's interesting. If you want to, and I can make a quick point of that in terms of, using our dominant hands for certain things. If you want to look at my hands right now, and you can do this with me. If you're driving, please don't do this. But if you're sitting on your couch, you can do this with me. Just put your hands up like this. And then what I want you to think about is I want you to think about like lifting something really heavy, just lifting something really heavy. And as you're thinking about that, I want you to chop one hand down into the other. Chop one hand into the other, just like that. Okay. So as you chop, I want you to recognize that generally most people chop with their dominant hand. Okay. So if you are a right-handed person, you probably chop with your right hand. If you're a lefty, you probably chop with your left hand. And that's most of the time that people do that. So it's a neat, it's a neat parlor trick. But the thing is, the reality is most people tend to chop with their right hand. Now, why did I ask you to think about lifting a heavy weight? Because I was distracting you. I wanted you to think about lifting a heavy weight and then being powerful, you would chop generally with your dominant hand. So that's more to the point, is we tend to do things, we tend to gesture, right, with our more dominant hand when we're especially trying to make a point. So does that mean that you should be watching and learning how people, are using their dominant hands? Not necessarily. And I think you can get into this rabbit hole, where I was starting to learn VAK, which is visual auditory kinesthetic. And there was a book way back in the day, Instant Rapport by Michael Brooks. And that is an old school book. I actually got it right here. It's one of my purple books. You can see how old it is just by the vintage 1980 something cover on it, and how yellow the pages are. So this is one of my books in here. But actually, I'm just flipped open to a page here, and you see how it's got the design, and it's telling you how to where in the direction that someone is looking left or right, in terms of if they're constructing something, or if they're imagining it, or if they're remembering it. To be honest with you, I don't really know that it's worth going into that level of detail of saying, okay, well, if someone is going up and to the left, they're fabricating a thought. If they're going up and to the right, they're remembering a thought. To be honest with you, I really don't think it matters that much. Not necessarily as business owners, and not necessarily in the sales process. And I'll tell you why. Because at the end of the day, if you have a good lead generation function, these people, if they're going to do business with you, it's because you're doing good business. And you have a good lead generation engine, which brings value to them up front. If someone's going to lie to you in the sales process, or you have an employee that's not being entirely truthful, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't know that there's really any value in trying to figure out if someone's lying or someone's not. I mean, and I'll give you a good point in terms of, just understanding body language. Most people understand they really can't lie to their mothers. They may think they're getting away with it, but most time moms just pick their battles. And the reason why they can't lie to their mothers is because the mothers have been looking at this baby since literally the moment they were born. They know every tick and every movement and of their face and every gesture. So they have been looking at your baseline forever, in terms of, when you're telling the truth, you're generally making a gesture in one way or the other. And when you're not necessarily telling the truth and they know that you're lying, you're generally gesturing another way. And even though the mother may not necessarily, basically say, oh, because you looked over to the left or you looked over to the right when you answered the question, I knew you were being truthful, or I knew you were lying. They may not necessarily know that intuitive, or like where they could describe it, but they know it intuitively. They know it like there's something that's not right. There's something off with the baseline. That's why women's intuition, when it comes to, like, for example, there's plenty of women that I know that say, hey, why don't you like Tommy? He seems like a nice guy. And they're like, yeah, he seems like a nice guy, but I don't know. There's just something just, I don't know. I should like him, but there's something that's just not lining up. And that incongruence maybe saying the way he's acting and the way he's speaking are not congruent. They're not in alignment. So it's just kind of that, I don't know. I'm cautious. I don't really know. There's something there that I don't necessarily know. So the confused mind will always say no. So in that particular case, when you're starting to think about this from that baseline, that's when you really can understand, someone. And again, this is not like, you're not conducting interrogations with your employees. You're not conducting interrogations with your sales prospect. You're not saying, okay, tell me your name, and tell me your first name. And they're like, Mark. And you're like, okay, tell me your last name, tell me your date of birth. Where were you born? Right. And it's establishing that baseline. So then it's like, okay, so now tell me, why don't you want to do this, this project that I'm pitching to you? And it's like, oh, you look to the left, so therefore they're lying. Look, man, it doesn't matter that much. To be honest with you, understanding body language, I'm going to give you, from my perspective, I think you treat body language in this way. Number one, it's really just a continuation on of the value that you created in your lead generation. You should always be leading with value. Help them solve a problem. Help them solve an initial problem. And then with that initial problem, you're helping them solve the next problem. Your offer should help them solve the next problem. If their gutter fell off because, the little rivet popped out, just show them, hey, get a rivet gun, put it in there, squeeze it, you're done. You don't necessarily need, a whole set of new gutters. If the gutter fell off because it pulled off the fascia board, okay, now that's a different bird, right? That's a bigger fix. And maybe the rafter tail ends are all rotted away, and maybe that all needs to get, maybe they need a whole new roof system because of that, right? Because there's, water damage and all this other stuff going on. So it's like, provide the initial value first. Give them value, give them content that actually is helpful for them. Don't just tell them about what it is that you do. Just give them value until they start asking, well, what is it you do? Like, how do you actually make money? Give until they ask. And that's something that I learned from Alex Hormozi. And I think, man, that is just such a brilliant idea. And that's actually worked for me very, very well. I've kind of done that all along until I heard him say that. And I was like, man, that actually tracks with exactly the way I like doing business. Give until they ask what it's like to work with you. And that just makes a lot of sense. So I guess to wrap up this thing in terms of, is body language relevant? I do. I think it's relevant in the sales process in terms of mirroring and matching. So when you're mirroring and matching someone, it's, if someone is, if they're open gesturing and they're having a an open conversation, palms are up, palms are open, that may make more sense to have the similar gestures. Don't be ridiculous about it. Don't try to necessarily mirror them exactly. But if they, if they're scratching their head, they're scratching their chin, yeah, then maybe you do the same thing. Maybe you fold your arms too if they fold their arms. It doesn't necessarily mean that's closed off. I will say one thing in terms of body language that you should be looking out for that does matter, and that is a transition in the body language. So, for example, if you say something and say, hey, look, I'm going to give you this quote, and it's a little bit pricey. We're probably looking to spend somewhere between $70,000 and $90,000. Watch for the transition in the body language in that moment in time. It's not necessarily that they cross their arms. It's not necessarily that they lean back or lean forward. It's the transition, right? So it's not necessarily that they're leaning forward and they're interested. They may lean forward and then they might put their hands on their heads, and all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute. Like, they were leaned forward, they seemed interested, they put their hands on their, like, it's something that changed. That's what you're looking for, is the change in body language. It's the transition that happens during a pivotal moment. So if you gave the pitch and you're like, hey, it's going to be somewhere between 70 and 90,000. Now I can probably sharpen my pencil, but I just want you to understand, before I go and work up this massive quote, that's kind of the number that we're looking at. Is that roughly what you think that you can afford for this project? I mean, we're probably going to be looking for a 30% down payment on roughly $80,000. Is that something that you can afford right now? And if they're like, man, that is way more than I was thinking. Okay, well, you just saved yourself and them a bunch of time. But if they transition to a body language that's saying, man, I do not feel comfortable with this, right? They had some sort of, they start scratching their head. They move, basically whatever position they were in, they transition to something else. Call it out and say, look, I'm not sure how to read this right now. I'm sensing that you're just uncomfortable. Can you tell me where we're at on this? Like, just, tell me what you're thinking right now. And if they're being honest with you, and hopefully they will be, they'd say, man, if that's too much, we might be able to sharpen the pencil a little bit. We might be able to get that down. But I mean, if we're way off, if you're thinking 10,000 and we're at between 70 and 90, I think we need to educate you in terms of where that came up from, or where that number came from. So I hope that makes sense. So it's not necessarily the body language specifically, but it's the transitions that you're looking for. It's the transitions to body language that you're looking for to make it relevant to them, and say, hey, look, I'm just noticing a shift in you all of a sudden. What's going on with you? What's going on in your mind right now? And you can be honest with me, because I promise with you, I've got plenty of other leads. So if this is no for me, that's totally fine. And that way you can actually serve them in the way that they can best be served. And you're doing that by being honest with them. You're doing that by noticing the transition in the body language. Other than that, I don't really think there's any real reason to study body language to the point where you're thinking someone is being deceitful. Like, you're not a cop. You're not going to be like, okay, if they move their hand to their head, they're being deceitful, which is generally true. But if that's the case, or they're covering their mouth, or they're doing something along those lines, man, it doesn't really matter that much. Just pay attention to the transitions in body language during the sales process. And then if there is a transition, call it out. Say, hey, look, I'm sensing something different all of a sudden. kind of tell me what's going through your mind right now. So that's it. So if you got any questions on this, of course, you can always reach out. But what experiences have you had in seeing transitions to body language, or maybe different things that you have noticed that maybe there may be some truth to that? Hey, did you chop with your left hand and you're actually a righty? Let me know in the comments. All right, guys, that's all I have. Have a great day. We'll see you guys next time.